Today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
To many people, that was Donald Trump rewriting the history of Russia's invasion of Ukraine to blame Ukraine rather than Russia. What's going on and what does it mean? We will discuss that on this episode of the BBC's daily podcast, Newscast, where we'll be joined by a former government minister who was in the room at the time when the Russian invasion happened. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we are recording this episode of Newscast mid-afternoon on Wednesday, the 19th of February. And as I said on a previous episode, I think at the moment where the world is changing every hour, it's important for me to tell you when we are recording so you know what we know. But I promise you, everything we say, even if it's slightly superseded by events, the analysis and the background and the insight at the heart of it will be valid, whatever. So we're going to talk about the new inflation figures in the last bit of the podcast, but as promised, the first bit of the podcast is going to be the conversation we had with the Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey. He was in that role from 2020 to 2024, so he served under Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, and he was there in the Ministry of Defence when Russia invaded Ukraine around about 3 years ago. And as I was saying, he has a reputation for being quite a straight talker. So we thought it would be worth talking to him. And one of the things we put to him was the comments that Donald Trump made on Tuesday night, where he seemed to blame Ukraine for the invasion, and also the response to that by his old boss, Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson posted this on social media. And I'll just read the whole thing out so you know what it is before we start the conversation. Boris Johnson said, "Of course, Ukraine didn't start the war. You might as well say that America attacked Japan at Pearl Harbor. Of course, a country undergoing a violent invasion should not be staging elections." This is because Donald Trump said there hadn't been an election in Ukraine for a while. Boris Johnson goes on, "There was no general election in the UK from 1935 to 1945. Of course, Zelensky's ratings are not 4%. They're actually about the same as Trump's." And that's a reference to the fact that Donald Trump said Zelensky was not popular in Ukraine. And then Boris Johnson concludes, "Trump's statements are not intended to be historically accurate, but to shock Europeans into action." And then he talks about one of the actions could be using frozen Russian assets to spend on supporting Ukraine, and also to give to the US to say thank you for supporting Ukraine. So that's some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in this interview with James Heappey. Oh, and one other thing. Lots of people in Westminster have been reading the Times newspaper on Wednesday morning because they've serialised the diaries of the former Chief Whip, Simon Hart, who did that job when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, so was responsible for maintaining party discipline amongst the Conservative Party and learning everyone's secrets. And there's all sorts of scurrilous tales, many of them anonymous, coming out of that book. So I'll mention that to James Heappey as well when we speak to him. James, hello.
Hi.
We'll go through the day's news in a second, but just first of all, a psychological question for you. I mean, having been so responsible for our armed forces and like the security of the world when you're in office, like, do you still feel that responsibility now, even when you're quite a few months out of the office?
Yeah, to a degree. And it's odd because when you're overseas, particularly, people do still ask you what you think in a way that, you know, is well beyond what I would expect to say as a private citizen. But I know fundamentally that, 4 years in the MOD was a huge privilege. I sat round the table for some really consequential discussion. It's the turn of others now. And the other thing that you remember is no matter how brilliant the journalism is, no matter how well sourced the stories, none of it, you're reading none of it with the benefit of the intelligence that you're so immersed in.
Well, that's what I was going to say. What's it like not knowing the secret stuff anymore?
In many ways, a blessing, right? I mean, for two reasons. Firstly, that when you're reading that stuff, you're constantly on your guard to not compromise it. And particularly, when I was doing
I used to do lots of the morning round interviews, on Sky and BBC.
And one of the challenges was really in the morning, part of my job would be to make sure I knew what happened overnight. But then you're getting briefed by the media team before you appear on the Today programme and trying to make sure you remember what's the stuff you've just been briefed by the media team that is disclosable versus what's the stuff that you read on a special coloured piece of paper that is definitely not, is part of the art of doing that. But look, I just, I probably sleep easier not knowing that stuff nowadays. Like some of the things that you read are really quite alarming. And it's good that ministers are shown that stuff. It's good that our intelligence agencies are so good at providing ministers with that fidelity. But there are times when you're reading stuff and you're going, I cannot believe I'm reading this. This is
really? And even once you've been doing the job for a couple of years, you can still be gobsmacked.
Yeah, I mean, and particularly when when Medvedev had been on a bender and started sort of talking about nuclear stuff, and you couldn't, the conversations you were having, when the chief of the Joint Intelligence Committee was saying that we've seen no sign of Russian strategic forces doing anything other than business as usual. But on the other hand, sort of Putin's number two is rattling the nuclear saber, and I can't believe I'm in these conversations. Quite extraordinary.
Right, let's listen to some of the events of today. Well, actually, this is an event from Tuesday night, and this is Donald Trump doing a press conference where he made some quite ear-catching comments that everyone's been talking about.
I think I have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way.
Where would you like to start? I see you looking, your eyes are tilted towards the ceiling.
In a place of absolute despair. And I don't know how so many of the US intelligence agencies, their military, their State Department diplomats will sort of listen to that. And I get that they'll be as professional as the UK civil service are about you serve the democratically elected government of the day impartially. But it's only 3 years ago, almost to the day, that US intelligence around the Russian false flag activity in order to deliberately, to show Russian culpability in how all of this was being developed, was being passed to us, a decision made to declassify it, knowing that the UK media rounds happened before the American media rounds, and so you could get momentum into a point of view far earlier by doing it in the UK.
And this was getting people to get real about the fact that Russia was going to invade in the first place.
I mean, so we knew that what Putin was trying to do was engineer a number of events that appeared to give him cause to go into Ukraine to liberate a sort of downtrodden Russian-speaking, Russian passport-holding minority. There was stuff around, dirty bombs. There was all sorts of false flag activity. The US intelligence agencies got most of that. In fact, pretty much all of it. Or, of course, they got all the stuff we know about. Who knows what else there wasn't. And such was the race to sort of dominate the narratives in those early days that it was decided that it would be declassified to a US newspaper overnight US time, but that we would be the first to talk about it on broadcast.
It was a big deal at the time. I remember I was a political correspondent at the time. It's like, oh, wow, we don't normally see this.
Absolutely enormous deal. But to then 3 years on, hear the whole genesis of the war being rewritten by the President of the United States is really affronting because it denies the facts. It's a rewriting of history whilst the history is still the ink's still wet on the page. I mean, it's the most ridiculous situation.
I mean, Boris Johnson, your old boss, he tweeted or posted on X earlier today, not necessarily defending Donald Trump, but not really criticizing him either, and basically making this point that, okay, Donald Trump doesn't say things that are necessarily historically accurate. That's Boris Johnson's phrase, but it's for a noble goal. It's to encourage the EU to step up on defense or to start spending some frozen Russian assets on kit for Ukraine. That actually it's okay if he exaggerates a bit here or there.
Well, discuss. And when the history,
please do.
And when the history of all this is written, who knows? Trump might prove to be some sort of genius, that he did the right thing. He changed the shape of the world. Well, it is true that Europe has had enough warnings. So, if 2014, when Putin went into Crimea and Donetsk, wasn't enough to get us to get our checkbooks out, 2022 should have been. All the way through the Trump 1 presidency, he complained about Europe's not investing in its own defence. in his candidature over the last 2 years, he's been saying it. So in many, many ways...
That's a very logical way of looking at it. But Boris Johnson is effectively excusing Donald Trump's rewriting of history, which a minute ago you were really
I
upset
don't join
about.
him in that.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
So,
I don't want you to...
so Boris Johnson is misjudging
So I
the situation.
definitely... I don't think that Boris should be excusing a retelling of how the war started because the ways suit the desired ends. That's just not... That affronts me. But if the point is, for heaven's sake, Europe, dry your eyes, you're not at the table because you've not done anything particularly consequential whilst the war's been rolling. Although even that is debatable. Ben Wallace was a great ally of Boris's. He's been tweeting quite regularly over the last few days that Europe has put more into the support of Ukraine than the United States has, once you take in all the non-lethal support as well as...
And it's also things like the American total includes lots of money spent in America buying American kit. So it's actually good for America.
Well, yes, but everybody else is guilty of that too. I mean, so I think that's probably not the best argument to go down. But fundamentally, in terms of euros and pounds spent versus dollars spent, Europe has matched America, if not exceeded. So... but the reality is that we have fundamentally taken for granted the US involvement in underpinning the security of our continent. We've been warned enough times. If this fundamental shift in US foreign policy isn't the warning that we need, then the next one might not be till there are cruise missiles raining down on NATO allied territory somewhere. So I definitely don't think that sort of a creative rewriting of the recent history is acceptable. But if the evil genius in all of this is that Europe ends up doing what it should to secure its own continent, then that is a good strategic end.
But there are ways of doing that rhetorically and pushing at that door that don't involve rewriting how the war started and effectively blaming Ukraine
100%.
for being invaded itself.
And we're in, and this is one of the great challenges of the day, that people are just bombarded with a whole load of different fact, some of which is not fact at all, it's just outright lies. And if I think senior politicians, particularly in the West, where we've sort of set it as our MO, that our way of competing with Russian, Chinese, Iranian, North Korean disinformation activity that subverts our public discourse, is that, of course, we'll push back, we'll employ the same technologies and whatever else to be able to communicate as aggressively as they do, but that we will always tell the truth. That the sort of guiding star, the thing that the liberal West does that the authoritarians don't, is that we will tell the truth. If we surrender that high ground and we basically just go into a place where politicians on both sides of the divide just say whatever is expedient in order to get whatever political outcome they want, how on earth are publics supposed to maintain any confidence whatsoever in nation states or whatever else? I mean, this is big stuff.
Yeah.
But these are the stakes.
Yeah. Now, talking about former prime ministers, I'm just thinking back to last Thursday. We were doing an episode of Newscast in this very studio, and we were talking about the fact that Rishi Sunak had made a contribution to a debate. I think it was actually defence questions, and he'd asked the minister about in the event of a peace deal, would the UK provide support by land, sea and air? And if they did, he would support it. I'm not expecting you to be a spokesperson for Rishi Sunak, but I'm just so intrigued. Why do you think he intervened at that point? Because actually, a few days later, the entire conversation was about a peacekeeping force to secure a ceasefire and what contribution countries like the UK could make. What do you think was going on there?
Well, so he will have known, as I will have done, and other ministers that have been in that sort of national security orbit, that at the moment that he had the opportunity to ask the question will have been exactly the moment that Whitehall will have been starting to ask itself, how do we respond to this new reality?
Yeah.
And so it was a really timely catalytic
as a result of
question.
As a result of what Trump and Putin had said in their phone call the day before.
Yeah, exactly. So it immediately, rolled the pitch, stretched the envelope, whatever you want to use, and got the media, got the public talking, which is actually very helpful of Rishi. Rishi will have also known that in flying that kite for you, the media, to pick up on and for the British public to react to, it kind of gave the government a free dose of British public opinion
Yes.
in which to start calibrating the politics of what they might
And
do.
also that they weren't going to have a political problem in Parliament.
Well,
because they had somebody on the other side saying, go for it.
yeah, I mean, it would be good to see. In fairness, actually, both Kemi Badenoch and Ed Davey have been very, very supportive of the idea of troops being deployed into Ukraine.
Has Kemi Badenoch? When she said that?
Well,
I don't feel like I've really heard much from her in this last week.
Interesting. Okay, so I mean, I saw that she gave a speech in which she said we must be to the fore and leading in the response. I guess I assigned to her the view that
I suppose that was a line in a speech about other things, wasn't it? So
Yeah.
she's ticked the box, I suppose.
Well, and yeah, I mean that to my money, impossible to lead in what's next in Europe without making a very meaningful contribution to the security force in Ukraine. What's also interesting, I'm conscious that I sound like the ultimate centrist dad in all of this, but there's I think this is a real moment for it to
centre-rightist dad.
Well, yeah, maybe, but
anyway, sorry, make your point.
This is a wedge with reform. I mean, I do think that they have got quite an interesting line to walk here. So too does the right of my party, where they want to celebrate all that Trump is doing because therein they see a blueprint for quite a aggressive, ambitious right of centre agenda for a future government. But if I were them, I mean, I think there is fundamentally a side in all of this that is morally right, that is taking the high ground. That is, I don't think. Some people might say the politics of this are quite challenging, but I don't think you're betraying Brexit in any way by recognising that the UK is one of the three leading European powers, and that if you're drawing together a European response to a geopolitical event on which the UK and the US are not necessarily on the same page. Yes, the UK has a really important role in being the bridge between Europe and the United States, but that fundamentally the UK should be embracing the opportunity to be integral to the European response to violence. And that is not Nigel Farage, a betrayal of Brexit, nor Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. Is it somehow on a big I told you so moment?
Yeah.
It's just the reality of the moment.
Do you think Kemi Badenoch is maybe holding back a little bit on talking about Ukraine and a future peacekeeping force because of those kind of electoral threats that she might be perceiving?
I worry so.
Right.
But I also saw some really good polling the other day.
And the consequences for the country of that could be?
Well, I mean, I just think I've always said, but I'll take your term rather than the one I gave myself. As a centre-right dad, I've always felt that there's an ocean of political space between the right-hand end of the Lib Dems and the left-hand end of Reform, in which a Conservative Party could pretty confidently stake its case for government, and that we don't need to stray off to the right chasing after Reform. And the polling that I saw the other day, which broken down by the four main parties asked for public opinion of Trump, Putin and Zelensky, showed that overwhelmingly, the majority of the British public have quite a positive view of Zelensky and a very dim view of Putin, and the position on Trump was slightly more nuanced. So chasing after this idea that sort of throwing Zelensky under the bus because it stakes out, it eats Reform sandwiches in terms of UK domestic politics would feel very tactically wrong.
Just going back to that phrase you used about when we were talking about Rishi Sunak, about Whitehall starting the process of just getting its ducks in a row for what the UK contribution should be. Does that mean there hasn't been any work, you didn't oversee any work on a future imaginary peacekeeping force while you were in office?
You have to wait another 20.
Oh, the 30-year rule. I mean, it would be unusual if you hadn't done that kind of like horizon scanning, future gazing sort of work.
So I mean,
I'm trying to find a diplomatic way of you being able to show that you've done the responsible thing without breaking the law.
No, well, I think people have to assume that all the way through the first 2.5 years of the war, 2 years of the war, and certainly until I left office, I was exposed to a very healthy and constant asking of what if, what could we do, what would be the impacts of this. We never, to be fair, considered putting troops on the ground or anything like that. We were constantly asking ourselves what was the next capability threshold that we could get through, realising that we had a leadership role in that globally. We never contributing the most, but invariably we were the first to go through barriers, and then others would follow. And
teaching us all a lot of names of military kit as we went, like HIMARS.
Yeah, well, exactly. And the thing that we were talking about, which I always felt, well, actually, that's not true. There'd be generals, admirals, air marshals who would call me out on that. Initially, I was quite worried about the idea that shifting the training efforts. So at the moment, we train Ukrainian soldiers in very large numbers here in the UK. There was a discussion about whether or not we should shift that training to the west of Ukraine as a sort of foothold for getting back in, normalising the a Western presence in the rest of Ukraine, albeit explicitly in a non-combat role. Initially, I was quite nervous about what the escalation impacts of that could be. I'm on the record many times since saying that I actually think it's something that we should have done by now. Right. And we should definitely be doing it now, and we should definitely be contributing on land, sea, and air to the sort of security force that goes into Ukraine to secure the country afterwards.
So just to be clear, so irrespective of what's happening with negotiations, whether Ukraine's involved or not, whether it's just between Russia or the US, whether the EU leaders are agreeing or not, we could actually send a troop of a bunch of, picking my words not very wisely, a bunch of military advisors into Ukraine now to start the process.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the training mission that we've been doing in the UK could switch to Ukraine now relatively straightforwardly, and that's been the case for the last year or so. If I had supported the advice when it first came, it may have not succeeded at subsequent stages in the government decision-making process, but arguably it could have happened sooner.
And that would be a few hundred people?
Yeah. But, I think that would have been a good thing to have done in hindsight. Whether or not... But I think now we must. And I understand the politics of, the Europeans meeting and trying to insist on some sort of US backstop to their contribution, because it puts a massive dollop of deterrence around that European contribution to Ukraine, but B, because it keeps the United States engaged. It keeps the United States as a stakeholder in Ukraine and European peace and security. They may or may not be successful in that negotiating aim. But what we mustn't do is sit round waiting for the White House to change its mind. I do think that the challenge that is coming from the Americans around, hey, Europe, if you've got something to say and you're actually going to, there's a great Texan quote of all hat, no cattle.
Yeah.
And I think the Americans probably think the Europeans are all hat, no cattle, that we want to be in the room because it's diplomatically nice to be in the room.
But not do the hard work or
but
spend
actually,
the money.
how much money are we going to spend? How many troops we're going to commit?
And what would that US backstop actually look like? And I know backstop is Keir Starmer's choice of words, and you're not from the Labour Party, so you don't have to speak for him. But like, what could the elements of a US backstop in Ukraine look like?
Well,
what would it be?
In these moments, I find party politics somewhat irrelevant. If the government's failing, they deserve to be called out. But Keir Starmer has an amazing opportunity to define the next 30 years of European security. It's not zero-sum. It's not that the UK has the space and at the expense of the Elysée and the Chancellery. The reality is that what will be fantastic right now is for Starmer, Macron, Scholz/Merz, and von der Leyen and Rutte to all be on the same page, really out there, confident about what Europe can do, driving a solution, and we should be cheering the British Prime Minister on in doing so, whether he's Labour or Conservative or who cares. That's this is a really important moment for our continent that sort of transcends sort of petty day-to-day party politics. I think what he means by a backstop is that security guarantee. So firstly, it's the enablers, it's the intelligence, the surveillance capabilities that only the United States has and that Europe is years away. Even if we put loads of money in the pot right now, we're just not going to develop
and which
them
we never
enough.
see as outsiders, as observers.
We see more of it than any other country on earth. I
suppose you guys in the corridors of power saw it. I mean, us as mere citizens.
No, true. But the I think what he also means by a backstop is the confidence that I don't think you could apply. I don't think it's an Article 5 thing, which is the NATO collective defence clause. I don't think he's saying if we go to Ukraine and they blow up a British base, that's an Article 5 moment. I don't think the US would go for that. But I think it is something else whereby the US are a security guarantor, and that if Putin comes again and the rest of Europe finds itself in a war in Ukraine as a consequence, that the Americans are actually going to get involved. And it's not going to take, 3 years like it did in the Second World War for the Americans to sort of just throw off their isolationism.
And that image you just conjured up there of the Russians blowing up a British base in Ukraine. I mean, I'm quite grateful that you've gone there, because so much of this discussion is done in euphemisms and diplomatic language. But actually, when we talk about a British presence in Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping effort, that's a thing that could happen. And people just don't normally put it in those terms, because they dress it up as something less scary.
So the risks are stark. And I've seen, various people say, oh, well, it'll be easier if we just did a bit of air policing, put some Typhoons above. Easy until a Russian surface-to-air missile shoots down a Typhoon. It's the same impact.
Because then you could be at war with Russia.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so you've got to have your eyes wide open to what these risks might be. It's also worth then, having been realistic and open about the threat, it's also worth being realistic about the fact that the Russians, they know the score. Like, lots of people within the Russian system came up through the Cold War. They know how the calibration of these are done. And even in recent history, we've seen in the skies above Syria, US and UK jets flying very, very close to Russian jets. And they sort of show their teeth at each other, but fundamentally the dance is done.
Never gets out of control.
No, and even in the Black Sea, I mean, there's only been one occurrence, which again is a matter of public record, of when when the dance hasn't been done properly in the Black Sea.
Yeah. With all your years of experience, give us some pro tips of things to look out for in the next couple of days, the next couple of weeks, that will give a hint of where we're going.
Adam, I'd love to. The problem is I have no idea. And the reason is that politics, international affairs are not being conducted right now
in a normal way,
in any way that I had any experience of. And so I would say to you, well, look for Starmer coming back from Washington with some sort of nod and a wink that behind the rhetoric there's a kind of an understanding of the US's role in the world. But I don't know for sure.
Yeah, that seems like quite an old school way of looking at things with respect.
I don't think that'll come. I think we saw the Vance speech in Paris last week, where he stood there with the president of France and the president of the EU Commission directly in his eye line, and basically sort of and said a whole load of stuff to the Europeans about the way they censor online debate. We're like, oh, jeez. And I text a few people saying, God, I think DEFMINS, the defence ministers' meeting, is going to be easy, because going to be interesting, because if Hesketh is going to be in the same style, watch out. And then Hesketh goes and does what he did, no US guarantee of European security, compromise on territory in Ukraine, a deal done for the Ukrainians but not with them. Blooming heck. And then the Vance speech in Munich. These are just different times, different rules. So Adam, who knows what happens next?
And just before you go, a totally different note, the former Chief Whip Simon Hart has published some extracts of his diaries from his time in that interesting job in the Times today. I mean, everyone is talking about it, and everyone is asking if they're going to be in it, and everyone is speculating who some of the characters he talks about, like, I don't know, going to brothels and orgies are. Is that really what it's like?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I never served in the Whip's office. I was the Prime Minister's Parliamentary Private Secretary, which is kind of closely working with the Whip's office. So I never got the full scuttlebutt. I do think that the Whips are endlessly amazed at how a bunch of people... I mean, it could be that it's the same in every workplace everywhere, but I can't believe that. I mean,
I'm looking at our office, and I know that none of those people go to brothels.
I don't know. I mean, some of them are
steady on.
But I mean, it's the.
I mean, does it surprise you or not that at least one of your colleagues was going to a brothel in West London and having to get kind of rescued from it?
Of course, it's extraordinary. But
just checking.
Yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I don't know why politics attracts these people. The other thing I'm quite nervous about is that if our politics becomes, ever more the preserve of sort of risk-taking narcissists, rather than sort of, people who are steady, proven in their careers, and then it may all get, who knows what Simon's diary in 20 years' time would have looked like.
And on a very boring note, it just shows that you guys, 14 years in government, is having a very long tail because like there's these books coming out. People are thinking about Tory sleaze, if they want to call it that. Liz Truss is doing another speech in Washington on Thursday. She's going to launch something, we're told, which makes it harder for your old colleagues to get back in government, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean,
or do you think in a year's time, actually, it'll be really in the rearview mirror?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't know. I mean, I kind of wish them well in making their case. In some ways, get it all out there, start to rebuild, and you start to rebuild from wherever it is you bottom out. And who knows whether that point's come yet. But as, again, being my sort of centrist dad, I am... The thing I despair about is that Simon's book comes out exposing a whole load of stuff there. The day after, there was another story about a minister, Jonathan Reynolds, having some dodgy stuff on LinkedIn or whatever.
He would say correcting work done by a staff member.
Well, yeah. But the staff member. But I've seen tweets that he put out.
What was your broader point?
That I think it just undermines public trust in politics altogether. And we spoke about this earlier on about Boris appearing to excuse Trump reinventing very recent history for the purpose of a political end. I think it really does matter that no politician is perfect. I have definitely got plenty of colour in my life, and we want politicians who are real, authentic, who have done stuff in their lives that is not any politician that from the age of 12 has wrapped themselves in aspic because they know that one day they want to be prime minister and therefore they want to be utterly unimpeachable when the BBC starts to look into their past, is not the sort of person we want running the country. But at the same time, we don't want people running the country who are endlessly kind of lying, misbehaving, or whatever else, because the public will react very negatively.
There's a happy medium.
Yeah, as ever.
James, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And just after James Heapy left the newscast studio around about 4ish on Wednesday afternoon, we got a post on Truth Social from Donald Trump, that's his own social network, where he said that Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, was a dictator. And he went on to say, I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered and millions have unnecessarily died. So that's the latest from President Trump as we pass 4 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon. Right, the final bit of this podcast is going to be an update on the economy because we got another number today and it's the latest for inflation. In other words, by how much have prices risen in January 2025 compared to January 2024. And here to guide us through it with the political implications at Westminster, as always, is Alex Forsyth. Hello, Alex.
Hello, Adam.
And here in the studio is Claire Barrett, who is a consumer editor of the Financial Times and host of their podcast Money Clinic. Hello, Claire.
Hi, Adam.
And you taught me the phrase last week, spending to save.
Spending to save.
Just explain that to people.
So it's the biggest money-saving myth. People think, oh, I'm saving 50% by buying this bargain item in the sale. No, you are spending money to acquire something you perhaps don't need. If you do not buy it, you'll get 100% off.
Yes, and I've been dining out on that ever since you wrote about that last week. Right, tell me the inflation number and then kind of disaggregate it into the different bits that contribute to it.
Okay, so inflation, 3%, higher than economists were expecting. That means the rate that prices are rising year on year is going up again. But I stress, if you think of the mountain of inflation that we had on all the charts after the pandemic, what we're expecting this time, we hope, is more like a molehill. The Bank of England said inflation was going to rise. The main factor behind that is energy prices globally are rising. We've had a cold snap this winter, bigger demand, question marks about what's going on in the world. President Trump saying drill, baby drill, etc., etc. Bank of England is hoping by the middle of the year, maybe touching towards 4% inflation, and then we'll start to fall back again. So despite today's higher than expected figure, financial markets are still expecting the Bank of England to cut interest rates twice further on this year, which will be good news for anybody who's either trying to get a mortgage or around 1 million people who are thinking that they'll have to refinance one. But interest rates are going to stay higher for longer than had previously been hoped.
And Alex, have you picked up any political consequences of this today?
Well, it's interesting, exactly as Claire was saying. Economists were expecting this, and so was the Treasury, as you might expect. So they knew that it was likely that inflation was going to tick up again. It went up a little bit more than they had been predicting. But I think the message very clearly coming out of number 11 and the Treasury is that this doesn't mean they're going to alter course, because as things stand, the trajectory for the way that prices are going to rise and what that might mean for interest rates is broadly as they're expecting. So what they're still hoping, I mean, don't get me wrong, this isn't good news for the Treasury, especially because inflation has gone up a little bit more than they were thinking, but it's certainly not going to force them to change course. And what they are still talking about very much is that they reckon if they can get the economy moving and growing, then, that is going to be the answer. We shall see.
And Claire, is this an example of political choices having consequences? I'm thinking about things that have happened lately that could have pushed inflation up, like putting VAT on school fees for private schools, for example. Has
Absolutely.
that had an effect?
It has had an effect. I can give you a scoop here, Adam.
Oh, great.
At the weekend, I'm publishing the annual FT bonus survey. Every year I ask FT readers to tell me about their bonuses, because it's the time of year where people who work in financial services will get a big multiple of their pay packet if they've done lots of deals.
And I bet they're happy to tell you as well.
Well, we make it anonymous, but
Okay.
getting this insight into how the wealthiest people in Britain are budgeting their vast incomes, there are still things that we can learn from this. And I said to them this year, what has been the biggest impact of the budget on your own private budgets this year? VAT on school fees, absolutely number one. Now, it's come out in the figures today as being one of the factors that's pushed inflation up. But of course, most people, certainly if you don't have children at private school, this 20% jump in school fees that's happened between December and January, it's not going to affect you. But the people who it is affecting are very wealthy people. And the question I have is, if, as one reader has told me, I'm spending my entire £50,000 bonus this year on covering the higher cost of school fees, will this have an impact on the economy? Because otherwise, these big bonus packets could have gone into new cars, new houses, a bit of bling. Lots of people like to buy luxury goods, watches, holidays. This is all spending in the economy, spending in restaurants, theatres, things that are employing people, giving them jobs. So if it's affecting a lot of families who are higher earners and they're not spending that money on the finer things in life, is there going to be an economic consequence? Obviously, we would also hope on the other side, the policy side, that there would be a very good economic consequence if schools, state schools, are getting higher budgets, and particularly if SEN funding is improved, because that's something that affects a lot of people in my life. But politics aside, there are going to be consequences to this.
You talked about holidays. What's going on with flights? Is it air tickets? Well, I mean, as if we still get tickets, you know what I mean? The email you get from the airline for your boarding pass. Have they had a kind of outsized contribution to this inflation number?
They have, and anyone who is lucky enough to have taken the week off and flown away for half term, my brother, I'm talking about him, well, no, he deserves a holiday. He's had a tough year, but flights are more expensive, and that is one of the things that has crept into this higher than expected number this time. But, air travel, it's one of those things, it's very dependent on the oil price, energy prices, as I've said, with the big worry. We're going to get the price cap announcement from Ofgem, the energy regulator, next week. There are already predictions that we're going to see domestic energy bills rise by 5%. So lots of people thinking about switching supplier, trying to moderate that jump up if it comes. And as I said, further into the future, we just don't know what the impact of the Trump tariffs are going to be on inflation around the world. But then more specifically to the UK, that other big budget measure, of course, was adding higher national insurance payments for employers on people they've got working for them. And there's two consequences to that. They could either pass on price rises, so we could see that having an upward influence on inflation, or they could try and cut costs by cutting jobs, which is certainly what lots of the big retailers and hospitality chains have said that they're thinking about doing. And again, that could be more bad news for the economy when those apply from the 1st of April.
And Alex, we should just talk about the fact that the public finances, this is a bit of a jigsaw here, and the inflation number is just one piece of the jigsaw. Another piece of the jigsaw is the spring statement that the Chancellor makes, and a piece attached to that is what the Office of Budget Responsibility predicts about the economy and the public finances as a result. Then there's this spending review, that's another piece. And then the piece that just is getting bigger and bigger by every hour seems to be how much the government's going to spend on defence in future years. We have to put all these pieces together, don't we?
Yeah, you completely do. And let me just give you one microcosm example of all of that, how a decision that's taken in government might have one impact and then another effect. So what the government is saying in response to these inflation figures is they want more pounds in people's pockets, right? Obviously, inflation means that costs are going up, but they are also pointing to things like wages going up and the fact that they have chosen to increase the minimum wage from April, which is going to mean that people are having more money in their pockets, although prices are then rising on top of it. But the other way to look at that is that, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats and others say it is actually some of those decisions that the government has taken around, minimum wage, the amount they've spent, the tax increases, that is contributing towards inflation. So it's this kind of push-pull lever. And Rachel Reeves and the Treasury team have to have this all in their head as they're making the decisions and decide if they pull that lever, what's the impact going to be? And you're completely right. When you just pull back and put it in the bigger picture, I don't think anybody would dispute the fact that the economic picture is still looking unpredictable and difficult. And the truth is that one of the most serious points that the Treasury will be looking at is that OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility economic forecast that comes in March, because it's effectively going to signal to the Chancellor how much money that she has got or hasn't got to spend on public services, which is a key thing. There is a real push for increased defence spending because of the Trump response to what we've seen happen in Ukraine, and then all of the European nations saying we've got to really focus on increasing our defence spending as a consequence. How is the government going to afford that? And more broadly, how that all then plays into the wider economy when Rachel Reeves has set herself some pretty tight rules that she needs to abide by and that she's insistent she's going to stick to. So it's not like a kind of, 6-piece jigsaw puzzle. It's like an 1,000-piece one that you get for Christmas and then takes you a long time to complete, and you just hope that at the end the picture looks okay. And I think that's kind of, where the Treasury is to some degree at the moment.
And I apologise for coughing in the last 10 seconds there. I was stifling it for quite a long time.
I know, I was talking quite a long time. Sorry.
No, don't worry. That's not the insinuation. Claire, is there any other bits of economic data that it's worth looking at? Because I'm just thinking, I also saw people tweeting about the increases in rent in the private rented market. It's come down a bit from where it was, but it's still 8.7%. So if your rent's going up by 8.7%, that's higher than wages are going up by, and a lot higher than this inflation figure. So in some areas of the economy where it feels different.
Yeah, it's a lot higher. And even if the headline figures on the cost of renting are coming down, what worries me more is the number of properties that are available to rent. So, full confession time, I'm thinking about moving house at the moment. So I've been looking on various property portals in the middle of the night. And
not during the
day job. They're just so addictive. And the number of properties I'm seeing that are being sold chain-free, and when you contact the estate agent and say, why is this? It's a landlord who's selling up. I mean, an anecdotal observation, but nevertheless one that I find alarming. And I count myself lucky that I'm not trying to look for a place to rent because colleagues and friends...
Sorry, why is it so alarming?
Well, because if there are fewer places, if landlords are selling up and there are fewer places for people to rent, then A, it becomes much, much harder to move. And B, it's ultimately going to remain a lot more expensive. And if you're somebody renting with the aim of buying a house one day, you need to save up a big deposit. And unless the bank of mum and dad can swing in and give you a hand, as is the case with the majority of first-time buyers buying in London, they've got help from their family. If you haven't got that, then you're stuck renting for even longer. So, economic consequences too, if people can't afford to move, either moving into London, moving back to somewhere else where, there might be a job, people think it's too much hassle. I'm not going to do it.
And if we're talking about personal experiences of inflation, I went into a high street stationery shop today, not one of the fancy ones, because I was like, oh, I quite fancy splurging on a new notepad, and not like the stationery cupboard notepads, but like something a bit nice. So expensive. And it's when you realise something you haven't bought for a while, and then you clock inflation, because you're like, right, I'm pretty sure these used to cost like half the price.
It's also worth saying that when you're talking about personal experiences, one of the things that in this set of inflation figures where prices have gone up again is some of the real basic food things. So meat, eggs, butter, cereals, they are the things that people are really going to notice. And we know that when inflation really, really did peak, that mountain of inflation, as Claire was describing it, food was one of the things that people really felt, and they were really struggling to pay for their food bills. And you have to remember that when inflation comes down, it doesn't mean prices are falling. It just means they're rising less quickly. So therefore, I think when you look at these figures and you see that food inflation is up, and for some of those real basics that people will rely on as well, the personal experience that people are going to have with that is going to be really challenging. And, the bottom line is that the government is talking about more pounds in the pockets, but the measure of it that really matters is when people start to feel it.
Alex, thank you very much.
Pleasure as ever.
And Claire, great to see you too.
Thanks for having me.
I'm sorry our lighting in studio is not as fancy as Lorraine's on ITV. I've seen you popping up there quite a lot lately.
I'm happy to slum it with you, darling.
With the less famous Scottish broadcaster. And that's all for this bumper episode of Newscast. Hope you found it as interesting and stimulating as I have. We'll be back with another interesting and stimulating episode very soon. Bye-bye.